My name is Ken Dowden. I am the head of the School of Philosophy, Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham. The Cadbury Lectures are one of our proudest events. They give us an opportunity to bring in a great thinker and to give them the chance to unfold their ideas over a succession of evenings. This year we have been particularly fortunate to have Grace Davey to come and talk to us, who is one of the most humane scholars in the field of modern religion, a person concerned with communities and with society, with how society really functions. Her ideas have been profoundly influential. They have certainly set a lot of cats amongst pigeons, should we say. One particular idea which has caught the attention, and those of you that have been at earlier lectures will have come across this, is the idea of vicarious religion. The idea that other people do religion for us and somehow with our approval. And this has caused a very great stir in the world of the study of contemporary religions. Grace is an emeritus professor from the University of Exeter, but to say that is to pigeonhole her far too narrowly. She, in fact, has spent almost as much time in Uppsala in Sweden as in Exeter, and is concerned with problems worldwide. She has written extraordinarily widely on religion in Britain, in modern Europe, in America, and has something to teach us about the nature of religion and how it works, well beyond our individual religious beliefs or lack of beliefs. She has given a very successful set of lectures, and we are looking forward enormously to tonight's lecture, and the whole lecture, as I shall emphasize again at the end, will be made available as a published volume, and we are fortunate to have the publisher here with us tonight, Paul Britton. Paul, hi, thanks. Who represents the publisher Theos, whose particular diffusion, whose market enables us to get Grace's ideas to really interesting and important areas of the religious market, and not just to the narrow academic area which we might otherwise approach, as dry as dust academics as we are. I do not wish to take up any more of your time. If I were to read out the list of achievements with which I have been supplied, I'm afraid Grace would have no time to lecture. So may I ask you to address us on global challenges, the contributions of social science. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind welcome. I've really enjoyed being in Birmingham this week, and it's a great privilege to be in this truly lovely venue. I find that extraordinary, and I hope that we're going to have a really good evening to end this series. You're all kind of disappearing because the light's on me, but can I just check that you can hear me? Is that good? Right. And you will remember, those of you who've been in these lectures for the last couple of weeks, that I have a kind of framing statement which goes as follows, that in this country we are becoming more secular, steadily more secular. I don't think there's any denying that. But at the same time, we talk more about religion in public life. And this is a difficult combination. I think these two facts have come, are paradox. I don't think one caused the other. They simply have arrived at the same time. But it causes us some difficulty because we discover that our capacities to talk about religion well in public life are limited. We are losing, because of secularization, the vocabulary, the metaphors, the tools, the concepts, the imagination to talk well about religion. Hence, an ill-mannered, ill-informed, and ill-mannered debate, which is not really very helpful. And one of my aims in these lectures is to, as it were, set out the stall and suggest that we need to think more clearly about religious literacy, but to do this in an analytical way, not in a kind of blanket way. We need to think which bits of conversation or literacy fit with which events and parts of society. And we've done this in ascending order. We started with the local and included a number of rural issues which I wanted to bring into the conversation. And the second lecture was on the metropolis, on London, where new and unexpected things are happening, requiring an imaginative response. And on Tuesday this week, we looked at national conversations, and we looked at the debate that unfolded from Faith in the City and is now just about on 30 years. The papers have just been, the cabinet papers which covered that have just been made public. And we take our final step today and talk about the global. So I set myself rather a large agenda for this lecture, and I'm going to tackle it thus. I'm going to tell you about a project which has been running alongside these lectures. It concerns the International Panel on Social Progress. There you have the website, and as before, I'm going to leave you these slides so that you can find the detail. And there's the logo. And the International Panel on Social Progress is modeled on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in terms of process. That will become clear as we proceed. And the mission of this venture is to harness the competence of hundreds, and it is hundreds, of experts. I always liked that term till I suddenly found I was one, and now I feel a little uneasy about it, about social issues, and we are to deliver a report addressed to all social actors, movements, organizations, politicians, decision makers, in order to provide them with the best expertise on questions that bear on social change. So you can see that this is hardly a modest agenda. Here we are. If I left it up long enough, you could find me, but since I'm slightly vertically challenged, it takes a little time, so we'll pass straight on. But we are real people, that's the point. And here is our, if you like, context. This group of people are coming together, and as the slides unfold, you'll gather what they're doing or trying to do. But behind this project is an awareness that the nation state, as traditionally understood, is weaker than it was, and transnational issues are becoming increasingly significant. The group are very aware of powerful forces of technical change, altering the world of work and the relationships between capital and labor. They are equally aware of profound and unequal transformations in health and education. People recognize now, which is correct, that across the globe, incomes are rising. But inequalities are also rising, often within nations, not only between nations. And I've highlighted, of course, the bit that applies to us tonight and to me. They recognize that there are contestations between religions and between the religious and the secular. We'll come to that in more detail. And we're in a period of post-Cold War conflicts and insecurities, both within and between nations. So they are capturing, if you like, a 21st century debate and asking what social science can contribute to a better understanding of these issues. We have a huge number of chapters within this report which will emerge. This is the list that I've just taken off the website, and you can see that we are democracy and citizenship, poverty, inequality, well-being, global risks, resources, markets, finance, private and public governance, future of work, violence, peace and security, global health, religions and secularisms, gender, family, reproduction, sexuality, urban issues, urban-rural relations, education, communication, and the media. If you push a bit harder and boil it down a bit, you'll find you've got three sections. There's one on economics, the poverty, inequality, well-being, that kind of thing, markets, finance. And then you've got another section which is on politics, on governance and democracy, citizenship, that kind of thing. And then the ragbag bit, culture, into which we fit, as do education. The media have moved themselves to where they thought that it was more important, but I like the culture bit. And I am enjoying the work. It took a little while to, as it were, understand what we were trying to do. But we're now getting to a very critical stage, and it is extremely interesting undertaking. Now, each of us in our chapters, and I'm going to hone down onto the religious chapter, the chapter about religion in a moment, but in each case, we are asked to address the following questions. What is the current situation that we now face, and what are the historical and prospective trends? What direction of change can be inspired by the search for social justice? And what are the drivers and barriers that might prevent such change? I think it's very important to remind you to remember that this is not primary research. We're not out in the field gathering data. We put ourselves together as a group in order that we could cover between us an extensive range of literature, that we knew where to look to mine the best possible studies of this field. But it is not easy, and one of the real difficulties that I think we're all struggling with is that nobody is quite sure what social progress means. And we had some debate about this at our first meeting in Istanbul, which is where the first picture was taken. And the tricky thing is that the economists think one thing, and they're doing it metrically, and they're going to talk about the kind of economic metrics that you would put nation against nation and that kind of thing. And the politicians or the political scientists are headed towards certain understandings of governance. But for those of us working in culture, I think part of our task is simply to problematize what social progress means and to set out clearly in our chapters how we have understood that. And it's becoming clearer, but I'll show you how that is evolving. Now, here's the process, which is exactly similar to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There are 5 stages, and we are now where the bullet point is. About a year ago, I had one of those emails that you look and you think, oh dear. And it was an email inviting me to, would I think of heading up the group on the team on religion in this big project. And I was in Australia at the time, and I looked at this and I thought, do I, don't I? Retirement, other things to do. And then this awful voice comes into your head. What would it look like if I didn't do it? Can I risk it? And I was immediately on the slippery slope, of course. I said yes, and I did say, though, that I had to have the choice of my co-leader. And my co-leader is an American colleague called Nancy Ammerman, and the day she said yes was a red letter day. We then had to build our team. I'll show you the team in a minute, because that's all in the public domain. There's nothing confidential about that. And we had to think very carefully who we wanted to be with us. And we are currently just about, I'm going to Uppsala next week. You know I go there a lot, but it is rather fortuitous that it happens to be there that our chapter meeting is being hosted and paid for. but we have just established, it's very exciting, our complete first draft. It's a bit preliminary, and it's, you know, there's some gaps and a lot of work to do on it, but it exists. It exists. And instead of thinking, how on earth do we fill towards 35,000 words, we're now thinking, how on earth do we get it all in? Now, what happens next is that we then edit carefully, of course, and get a good narrative, and we submit on the 1st of July. And then we do something I think rather risky, it's not my decision, that all these chapters are posted in the public domain and open to public comment. We'll see. Then we come back again and see what everybody thinks about our work, take that into account as we do our final drafts. We meet again in Lisbon at the beginning of 2017, and finally we let it go. And then a smaller group of people will write a synthesis report. So quite a big-scale, long-term, very much in a process of learning together that goes through several stages. Now, here we are. Nancy Ammerman is my co-leader. She's an American sociologist, primarily working on American material, but also not only a fine scholar, but a totally reliable, dependable person who will lead and can see how to get from this place to that. And then I'm just going to do a little pen portrait of some of these people, just to show you how we tried to cover the bases, as it were. Nancy and I started with what is the problematic that we must cover? What are the topic areas that we have to get into this chapter? But at the same time, we had to have a reasonable range from different parts of the world, and we also had to have a decent representation of all the global faiths. And of course, the bottom line was, please will you pay attention to invite people from who are not working in either Europe or the US. And those aren't really very easy circles to squaring the circle, whichever round it is, because it is very difficult to find the right kind of scholar in the developing world who is not so overworked and is free and able to come. And so we did as well as anybody else did. And we have Samia Hook, who comes from Bangladesh. I'm going to tell you a little more about Samia and show you where you can find some very interesting things about her. Lucian Leustean, who's not far from you, he's in Aston, a specialist on the Orthodox Church, not only in Russia, Ukraine, which of course had to come into the frame, and Romania, Bulgaria, he is Romanian, but he also knows the very exposed Orthodox churches, Eastern Orthodox churches in the Middle East. So he's wonderfully well skilled for us. Tarek Massoud is a political scientist from the Kennedy School. He's Egyptian. And I'll show you his field of research too, just to begin to show you what the input, what we're taking in, as it were, to our work. He's written on the Arab Spring. Suzanne Moon was a gift from heaven because in our project, each chapter is assigned a specialist in technology because this they want as a linking theme, a transverse theme. And Suzanne is a scholar, a sociologist of technology. Her particular field is in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia. And she's contributed the most wonderful section on how religious groups understand the earth, sacred space, climate change, the environment, ecology, that kind of thing. And we would not have had that expertise without her. Jacob Olopuna is a Nigerian scholar working now in the US. You can see that. And he will equip us to speak in a very informed way about Pentecostalism in the Global South, and a lot on the understanding of well-being and social progress in Africa, because you can't simply impose a Western understanding of well-being, social progress onto other parts of the world. Ayelet Shachar is an Israeli scholar, worked in Canada, but is now at the Max Planck Institute in Göttingen. Her particular skilling is in law and religion, and particularly in gender law and religion, and how to really think carefully about legal issues in order that the law enables rather than prevents. Vanita Sinha is from Singapore, and she has done excellent work for us on managing diversity and pluralism in Singapore, which she knows very well. She's Indian, but she lives in Singapore, so she considers herself a minority in the Singaporean context. David Smiley is Tulane, which is in New Orleans, and he's a Venezuelan specialist and knows very, very well both the Catholic Church and the Pentecostal Church in Latin America. And he's so interesting when you talk about the detail of democracy in Venezuela and the placing of the churches and how they pull and push in different directions and how subtle these connections are and how careful you have to be in attributing any kind of connection between politics and religion. There are connections, but you have to know your case. Linda Woodhead, I expect a number of you will know, and she will be helping us with the gender, sexuality issues alongside Samia. So we have one working in the Western context out of a Christian background and about spirituality as we understand it here, and Samia doing a parallel thing on Islam. And Feng Yang Yang, again, you might know that name. He is in America, but he is from mainland China. He was my host when I went to China, and everything I know about that part of the world, which is not a great deal, I owe to him. He was a wonderful host and works extremely hard to ensure that scholars in the West understand the Chinese case, but always telling us very carefully that you cannot use Western social science in the Chinese context. You cannot simply translate your paradigm. How much you have to think about this in order to get, as it were, sound answers and sound understanding. And this is where we start in our argument. I think perhaps I should back up just a little bit, because I wasn't in the planning stage of this project, but what became very clear was that there were large numbers of people, significant numbers of people in the higher echelons of this project who were very uneasy about a chapter on religion because they did not think that religion contributed to social progress, ipso facto. And so this is not, it's not the easiest starting point, because it's quite a long time since I had worked in this intensity with mainstream social science. And you are required to justify your presence as leading the chapter on religion. And I suppose you will be talking about conflict. The assumptions are quite negative, and we have to work hard. But our agenda, where we started with each other, as it were, was simply the recognition. This is from the Pew Foundation. The details are a little bit, I mean, not everybody quite agrees on the precise percentage, but the Pew Foundation in America stipulate that more than 80% of the world's population subscribe to some sort of religion. But you have to note that religion itself is being constantly transformed as people live it. And so we have two emphases here. One is that religion is widespread in the modern world. That was one of the things we talked about a little bit in previous lectures when we were, as it were, mapping the European case, is that it is not a global prototype. And so we're starting with, as it were, the world this time. And not only are more than 80% of the world's population, as it were, assenting or giving themselves some sort of religious label, but this percentage is growing. Or to reverse it, the percentage of people who exclude themselves, who say no religion, is shrinking. It peaked in the 1970s because it included very large numbers of people from the Soviet Union. And this, of course, is counterintuitive, and you've really got to, as it were, insist this is the case. And so we have a wonderful postgraduate helping us with really good quantitative skills and also the capacity to turn them into attractive graphics. So we have our evidence. And thus, if 80% of the world's population subscribe to some sort of religion, it isn't really very sensible to ignore religion in the project of this nature. We have to pay attention to it. We also have to recognize that religious beliefs, practices, and identities are interwoven with every social system and must be addressed as we proceed towards a society in which humanity and the planet can flourish. It's not to argue it's good or bad, but simply that if we fail to pay attention to this central issue in the human condition, in human living, we are not going to achieve our goal. But we recognize straight away, right at the beginning of our chapter, that religion is neither an impediment to progress, nor is it a panacea. You mustn't assume one or the other. It can be either or both. And so the core of our chapter is to explore the ways in which religions contain possibilities, both for good and for ill, and to bring to bear the very best social science research on the conditions and circumstances under which religion contributes to, rather than impedes, progress. So there's a very specific analytical task. This is why you need a very broad range of people who can mine a very extended literature and find very careful studies which point either in one direction or the other. And you can begin to explore, if not necessarily nail all at once, the kind of conditions under which you are likely to get a more positive response. And off the bottom of your slide, unfortunately, is the key point that in so doing, we are challenging the secular philosophies of science that underpin mainstream social science. And this is why our presence is just a little bit uncomfortable. I mean, I think that sharpens us all. It gives us an edge. And I am very, very determined to deliver the best possible chapter with the help of a team that is deeply impressive. This is how we go about it. Of course, we have an introduction, everybody does. But what we have to, we make clear what our task is, which is to, as it were, discern the conditions under which favourable outcomes are likely. But we have to explore right at the beginning definitional issues and how we are understanding religion, lived religion, and how we are understanding social progress, what we are looking for. And there's a very strong emphasis in that this is more than simply assent to a cognitive set of precepts or a creed, that we're looking at the way people live and the complexities of everyday life. And then we plunge in to family, gender, and sexuality, which is the place where a great deal of the tension is revealed. Because a very large number of people think that, you know, women are, as it were, unfavorably placed within religions. And we seek to be a little bit more discerning, recognizing that is the case in certain forms of religion, but it is not the case in all forms of religion. And I am identifying and displaying the places where religion can empower women. And so we move across a whole variety of issues, including the nature of the family, and, as it were, exploring a tension whereby social science necessarily looks at the changing nature of the family, its malleability as you move through generations and decades and even centuries. And yet religions often have teaching that as it were, points to one way of being family. We've looked at this a little bit in previous lectures. What happens when society changes and the church's teaching looks, if you like, out of date? Do you move with society? Do you resist? Do you do both at once? And how do we resolve this kind of issue? Obviously, in our particular society right now, the issue is questions of same-sex, and that will clearly resonate in this part of our work. We move then to economic well-being, social welfare, and healthcare, which by and large is easier to do because there is a lot of material on the positive input of religion into welfare and well-being, more in the less developed parts of the world, because you move also into the debate about development. But again, you're always on touchy issues, particularly gender questions. But Jacob, particularly from Nigeria, has helped us to understand, and so has David, who's working on Latin America, that it's not, as it were, the fallback position. Religion is not what you turn to when everything else goes wrong. There's a much more positive way of working that people in the global south, in sub-Saharan Africa, feel about this nexus and how well-being is often identified in religious terms. And you simply cannot, once again, impose the Western frame on that. And I've worked a little bit on these issues in a European context. Nancy knows the American case quite well. They're, of course, very different because most of Europe enjoys a welfare state, even if it's not as perfect as we would like, and the US is differently organized in this respect. Then we have the section on managing religious diversity, which is very interesting because we have some very nice graphics which remind us that religious diversity should not be taken for granted and is not necessarily growing. Now, we tend to think that late modern means diversity. In the Middle East, diversity is diminishing as people flee violence and war. The diversity in the Middle East is diminishing. The diversity in much of Africa is diminishing as people who did belong to traditional religions turn more or ascribe in more larger numbers to the global faith. And so you get varieties of patterns. If you look at a graph of Europe and you include in it Russia and East Europe, you see very little change between 1970 and now. If you pull those bits apart, you find religion in Russia growing, though the Jews are leaving, the Muslims are declining, and in Western Europe, of course, you find Christianity diminishing, growth in secular, and extending to greater diversity through the in-migration of people from other faith communities. So you have to be careful how you discuss these things, but the real issue, of course, is how you manage diversity. And here, as well as the Western case studies, Vinita has done us a wonderful study of Singapore, and Fengang has done us a wonderful study of China. It's not one that is reassuring, but it needs to be there. Then the peace and conflict group, religion causes violence. Indeed it does, but that's not the whole story. And I've just seen the first draft of this. I'm wonderfully impressed how they've done it, really looking at the detailed studies and the figures and which conflicts are essentially about violence. And the general consensus is not that many, proportionally, but they are very intense, and they are increasing. But we need to be clear, and we need to be precise, and we need to put the other side, too, in terms of peacemaking. And very, very good evidence of religious groups acting as peacemakers. Then the people working with power, participation, and political structures. interesting work on, is Islam compatible with democracy? And how do you understand democracy? And also showing, as it were, that this can be conceptualized in different ways. There are two sides to this question. It's not all about clash of civilizations. There's a lot of work done, and the team know this very well, and they're putting it together very clearly. And again, we're seeing the illustrations coming from Venezuela and again from China. And then we get the wonderful piece of work on the environment. And as it were, showing how some, particularly of the global faiths, including Christianity, have this notion of domination. But that, again, is not the whole story. And stewardship is a preferred term now, but also showing how very different views are coming out. The Patriarch Bartholomew is a good example, the present Pope, and then moving as well into Islam and into indigenous religions. So a big scope there. And here, of course, we touch very closely the work of the panel on climate change. Now, in the time that I have left, I'm not going to, as it were, disclose our findings because they're not yet public, and I feel that that would be inappropriate. I'm going to show you 4 examples of, as it were, the kind of thing we're drawing on and the expertise we're drawing on. But just before I turn to that, of course, when it does all go public in late July, it would be wonderful if you gave us some positive feedback and read the chapter, and as it were, because I really do hope that we get some very creative comments rather than, you know, religion caused violence, why did you include this chapter, which I suspect we will get, to be honest. But that's up to you. I would commend to you an interview that my co-leader, Nancy, did. You can find it here, which was a very nice overview of our work. It's beautifully presented. I was quite interested in how the website headlined it. I mean, it's a bit black and white, and this is straight off the website. The points of understanding why social progress does not require the abolition of religion. Well, that's a bit stark. And how the existence of religious groups can influence policies to promote social progress. And Nancy speaks to that extremely well, using an American examples and the issue of religious diversity in the United States. Now, here's Samia. I really recommend that you look in detail at this website. I find it extremely interesting. It's a long interview in 2011. I was very intrigued to read this and thought, I'm really delighted that Samia is helping us. And she discusses, it's a very interesting intellectual biography, autobiography, how she came to, as it were, Islam as a young woman, and how her participation in women's Islamic discussion groups inspired her to change her thesis topic and involved her in successive research projects investigating women's roles in Bangladesh. And one of the most interesting findings which she brings to our attention, of course, is that aspects of Islam in her own country are not as one would like, necessarily, particularly in their attitudes to women, but that there's very little point in confronting this with a Western secular alternative. You can't just do black against white. All that happens is a misunderstanding, increased tension, and an inability to think creatively. So she really thinks very carefully about, well, how do you equip yourself as a researcher to sit down with different groups of women and to fully understand their position and to begin to edge forward in a common agenda. It's a wonderful example of action research, if you like, of participation. And I found that extremely inspiring, and I'm really delighted that Samia agreed to help us. She, of course, is in Bangladesh, so we got all sorts of brownie points for that. Now, this is very interesting. I came across this. I was looking for material on healthcare in different parts of the world. And it's in The Lancet, July 15, so not very long ago. I put a Premier Medical Journal because I've presented this once or twice outside Britain, and I'm not quite sure how well known The Lancet is. And a whole set of articles on faith-based healthcare. They start with this same figure. An estimated 84% of the world's population is religiously affiliated. Faith is a powerful force in the lives of individuals and communities worldwide. This series argues that building on the extensive experience, strengths, capacities of faith-based organizations offers a unique opportunity to improve healthcare. And what is very interesting is that the case studies, it's a very big set of articles, there's a lot of material here, are AIDS and Ebola. And the comment, it's a series of 3 articles, there's a background report, there's 2 or 3 comment pieces, a short film clip that goes with it. So you can, it's quite, as it were, a dense piece of research. And if I'm honest, it didn't tell me anything that I didn't know. But I was genuinely surprised to find it in a premier biomedical journal. That was a thing that I thought was a real step that I had not expected to see it published in this place. And the AIDS and Ebola material is very interesting because someone like Jacob Olopuna, for example, will always say that initially the church's attitudes to AIDS was very negative. There was a lot of stigma associated with AIDS, which of course is not so closely associated with same-sex in Africa as it is in the north. It was an enormously devastating epidemic that went right across society. But it was the churches who turned around and realized enormous numbers of children no longer had parents and needed care, and really turned themselves into agents of care and also into attitude change. You find the churches or faith groups, because the Muslim communities are involved as well, very powerful in changing attitude and, as it were, overcoming stigma. And David Smiley talks a little bit about the same approach in Latin America. And the Ebola crisis, which of course is very recent, is extremely interesting because one of the things that had to happen if this was going to be in any way stopped was burial practice had to change. And only the religious groups could legitimate that you didn't have to do this and you didn't have to do that, that the burial just had to take place immediately, and as it were, took the population with them and were able to effect an attitude change which made a real and material difference to the outcome of that pretty devastating epidemic. And finally, Tarek Masood and his co-authors on the Arab Spring. And his question is very central. Why did regime change take place in only 4 Arab countries? And why has really only one of them, Tunisia, come out with any approximation towards a democratic government? And what, of course, he does is to look not necessarily at the Arab Spring itself, but at the deep historical and structural variables that lie underneath these countries, which are not all the same, to determine, as it were, which variables are likely to be those that enable and encourage positive change, and which variables are going to be those that impede that or prevent it. A lot of it is around a hereditary, as it were, power structure. I do recommend that. They're complex arguments, quite difficult to summarize, but you can see that's exactly what good social science does. It doesn't simply look at the superficial political movement. It looks at the deep structures, economic factors too, which lie beneath either success or partial success and failure. But as I've said, I think already, and probably more than once in the last 2 weeks, the turn to religion discomforts the mainstreams of economic, political, and social science, in that it calls into question the perceived links between modernization and secularization, and the assumption that lies over that in this link, in this connection, lies the pathway to social progress. That's really what we've got to take apart. And our challenge, this is why it fits in this kind of series of lectures, is to, can we find a discourse, a language, a literacy that speaks to these issues in ways that do justice to the constituencies that lie at the heart of our chapter, who are not social scientists, who are not politicians, political scientists, analysts, or whatever. They are the real people about which we write. And I feel quite strongly that our challenge is to find a language and discourse that bridges that rather formidable gap. I have 10 minutes to gather the threads. You will remember I called it levelling the ground, a rather play on words, simply to identify some starting points that we began with the local and built up to the global. And it was not a case of one size fits all. There is not a single religious literacy. There is a whole set of literacies, and we need to learn the appropriate ways to talk to particular issues and in particular places, and to be very precise in our language. I want now, and I'm only going to do 2 of these because I don't think I can do more and do justice to them, is to, as it were, give you some connecting threads. And this thread links, in a way, the national discourses and some of the work I did in the first lecture, though it spilled over into the second, on welfare, on intervention in, as it were, political debate, in skilling individuals, very grassroots stuff. And I learned this when I was working with the Swedish team on the Welfare and Religion project, which I did tell you about in the first lecture because it was a locality study. One thing we began to realize, or I began to realize, is that my formation in the sociology of religion, in the social sciences of religion, very much stemmed around the process known as secularization. That's how it was in the 1960s. I learned an enormous amount from David Martin, who wrote in 1978 The General Theory of Secularization. And this posits, many of you will know this already, that secularization is not simply a theoretical idea, it is a reality that unfolds differently in different places. So the process of secularization in France is different from the one in Britain, and it's different again in the Nordic countries or Southern Europe. It is significantly different in the US, and if you go into the global south, you're in a completely different ball game, if you like. Now, while I did the work on welfare with my colleagues in Uppsala, I got to know the literature about the evolution and development of the welfare state. And the equivalent of David Martin in that field is Gösta Esping Andersen, who wrote The Three Worlds of Welfare Capitalism. So we each had our Bibles, if you like. Now, if you read both those books, you are effectively reading the same story, but told from a different point of view. David Martin shows us how, bit by bit, the church cedes control or power or even influence over sectors of society, including the education system, the health system, and the welfare system. We now expect the state to deliver education and healthcare and welfare, though in slightly different ways in different places, and sometimes these splits are very partial. What David showed us is the British story is different from the French or the Catholic story, and the Nordic one's different again. And Gösta Esping Andersen shows how the welfare states evolve. And what you understand very quickly is the ecclesiologies of the major Christian churches in Europe are a major factor in the building of the welfare state. The problem is that very few people read both literatures. And so the connection is never made. It's not a hazard, for example. It's not by chance that in the north of Europe you have social democratic states. If you think of Luther and Luther's two kingdoms, and the two kingdoms, of course, legitimate the secular and legitimate the state and the work of the state, and it's a great idea that the state should deliver good welfare. And you, as it were, the Nordic churches bless the efforts of the state. Now, the Catholic Europe is a very different state of affairs because the Catholic Church has very developed social teaching, much more than most people realize. It's a very sharp critique of the market. But as soon as you come to the family, and if the welfare state of that part of the world encroaches on the family, the Catholic Church will be much more resistant. And therefore, you get a much more conflictual story in Southern Europe, nowhere more so than France. If you look to our own case, we have a rather different kind of Protestantism. It's not Lutheranism. And we have in us a much more individualistic instinct, which of course is even more developed in America. And you resist the welfare state because you should look after yourself and your family. And of course this was turned into a political virtue by Mrs. Thatcher, who we met a day or so ago. And I became very, very interested in that, as it were, marrying of two sides of knowledge that I had learnt one side as a young scholar. I learnt another one much later, but I could see how very clearly they fitted together, but how few people in the world of universities or even in praxis see these connections. So that is one thread that I'd like to draw together. And my other, which those of you who were there on Tuesday will recognize a little bit because we talked about 1979, but I'm only going to flag it up as one of three dates. We talked about the significance of the Iranian Revolution alongside a number of other things, seeing this date as pivotal in the late 20th century, and as the step towards 1989, which is the one most of us remember. And then, of course, we have 9/11. And this is, as it were, none of these could be surpassed in terms of how they changed the world. We remember where we were when these things happened. But what is so striking is that none of us anticipated any of them. They simply caught us by surprise 3 times over. We did not expect the Iranian Revolution. We did not expect the collapse of communism, though people who study the Soviet Union will say, well, we knew the economy was dodgy, but I don't remember them telling us that the Berlin Wall was about to fall. And 9/11 was a bolt from the blue. And I'm not going to argue that these are solely religious events. That would be foolish in the extreme. They're complex, I mean, there are many, many reasons for why these happened at these times, and we need to see the complexity of each of them. But I will argue that had we paid a little bit more attention to religion and its continuing significance in the modern world order, had our religious literacy been a little bit more developed, had we been rather better attuned to what was happening across the world, we might have had a better shot at it. And it's for that reason that I argue strongly in favour of improved religious literacy. And thank you very much for the opportunity to develop these ideas with you. Thank you for your attention.
With that, we come to the end of this series.
series of Cadbury lectures, and that leads to remarks which I must make about the present and the future. A principle amongst remarks about the present is to thank Grace for a wonderful series of lectures and a wonderful versatility and sympathy towards the modern world and the real nature of religions in it, getting below the surface, not relying simply on the doctrinal or dogmatic side, not relying on the prejudice side of much political analysis, but actually looking at what's really there. And in particular, the project she's outlined tonight has shown us the immense complexity of arriving at sensible, realistic, fact-based views about religion and its role in the modern world. And you have done us a real credit in laying out this project in front of us, though, of course, you've been cruel to us in that we have yet to see the text. But at least we will have it there to edit, will we not? It has been absolutely wonderful. Your whole approach to the subject has been an illumination, and I invite you to show your appreciation in the normal way. One other thing about the present is that I failed to note at the beginning that we're not in the University of Birmingham here, we're in the city of Birmingham, and we're in its wonderful new library building, which, whatever view we have of its architecture, is an expression of culture for the people and for the population as a whole of Birmingham, an attempt to reinterpret what it is to have a library in the centre of our city, just as Grace has shown us what it is to understand religion in our world and in real people's lives. It's a privilege to be here in our one of the most amazing products of our modern city, and I think it's been hugely imaginative to cite this particular talk here. Turning to the pragmatics, could I ask for a show of hands of how many people found it more convenient or more pleasant to be here than in the distant Edgbastonian reaches of the university? Yes, that's really interesting, and thank you for that wholly unscientific sociological survey. I would also like, obviously, to thank everybody who's been involved in organising this series of lectures. I don't want it to seem like the Oscars, so I won't go in enormous detail, but let's mention Tamsin's role in making the organisation actually work, and our student helpers for guiding people as they will. And there will, in a minute, be important work for them to do. Turning to the future, and I must turn to my notes here, there are a number of things I should mention. Grace's lectures will take book form and they'll be published by Paul at Theos. Theos, for those of you who don't know, is a think tank which explores the impact of religion on public life. So that's the sort of context into which it fits. Next year's lectures will be delivered by Professor Candida Moss of Notre Dame University. She's an expert on early Christianity and contemporary Catholic affairs, including Pope Francis. So that sounds very, very exciting, and we'll look forward to that next. But in the more immediate future, we have a reception taking place in the book rotunda of the library, and I think many of us are looking forward to exploring the geography of this building with a glass of wine in our hands. Our student ambassadors will take us there next, so thank you all very much indeed, and especially Grace.